Track work is one of the most important aspects of building a layout. If trains are constantly derailing, you're going to get really frustrated really quick and probably get burnt out. So many people start building a layout only to give up in frustration because they can't move a train very far without getting a derailment. Hi friends, my name is Steven and this is my channel, Signal Up Productions, where I make videos all about trains. In this series of building my UP St. Marshall sub layout, we're going to get into how I did the track work, and I'm going to show you some of the tips and techniques that I used for getting that aspect of this layout building project done. But before we get into that, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, then click that bell icon so you're notified every time I post a new video. Now, let's get started on this so we can get closer to running trains.
With the track plan handy, I start to mark out specific points on the layout surface. The long straight sections are where I started first. I knew that the main track was going to be parallel to the outside edge 5 inches away. I used a 6-foot metal straight edge and a pencil to mark the track center line. Once I got to the ends of the straight section, I marked out the center points for the curves. I used a piece of scrap wood to make a trammel. On one end I used a nail, and on the other end I drilled a hole exactly 28 inches from the center of that nail. The hole was just large enough to insert the tip of a pencil securely. I carefully arced the trammel, creating a smooth centerline for the curve. I'm using Peco flex track and the new Walthers turnouts. These turnouts are an all-new design and not to be confused with the old Shinohara switches. All the track on this layout is code 83. This is a good representation of 132-pound rail as used on the prototype. I set out all the turnouts in their expected positions and then marked the center lines as well as the location of the throw bar. The yard ladder needed to be accurately placed, so I would know they would line up with the center lines of the yard tracks. Once I knew the location of the switch points, I used a 1/4-inch drill bit to drill the center hole for the switch machine throw rod. I elongated that hole to allow more room for the throw rod to travel. During the benchwork phase of the project, I made sure to avoid placing any cross braces where a switch machine would need to go. This is why it's important to have an accurate track plan and reference it throughout every point of your construction. I'll install the switch machines in a later video. Prior to starting this layout, I built a few different dioramas to test out some new products that were on the market. One of those products was Track-Bed by Woodland Scenics. These foam strips work just like regular cork road bed that most people are already familiar with. I like working with it so much I chose to use it on this layout. They come in 2-foot long sections as well as a 24-foot long roll. It's also offered in large sheets for covering large areas of tracks. The strips have a score line that allow them to be easily ripped in half. A small bead of caulk is then squeezed on the center line on the benchwork. Then it's spread very thin with a putty knife. The roadbed for the curved area of the track that's ripped in half, and then I pressed it into the caulk following the center line. The roadbed is flexible enough and makes smooth curves when it's ripped in half. The caulk is sticky enough to hold the roadbed, but I tap in a few T-pins to the plywood just to make sure nothing moves while the caulk dries. In the places where the track is straight, I just used a whole piece of roadbed without ripping it in half. Just match the ends up of one piece of roadbed to the other, following the center line, and then look down the length of it to ensure it's nice and straight. When I came to a switch location, I just kept the roadbed on the straight route hole, and I cut the section for the diverging route at an angle. Once all the roadbed was in place and the caulk had a full day to dry, I moved on to adding the track. Since the position of the switches was critical, I installed those first. One thing I don't like about the Walthers switches, the head block ties only come off the diverging side of the turnout. If you're creating a yard ladder, then these have to be cut off and repositioned to the other side. All of the track is glued down with the same caulk I used for the roadbed. White caulk is handy here because you can more easily see it where I started and stopped and how thin I spread it. It'll all get painted and ballasted anyway, so the white caulk won't be seen. A very thin layer of caulk is spread along the top side of the roadbed. You definitely do not want it to be oozing up between the ties when you press the track into it. Also, make sure not to spread any caulk around the switch points or the throw bar. The main track is going to have a signal system. That means I need to isolate the spurs and the yard tracks, as well as split the main line into blocks. I'll use plastic rail joiners for this, installing them as I go. I insulated both rails to make troubleshooting easier if there was ever a problem. Once the switches were glued and dried, I started filling in the areas between those switches with Peco FlexTrack. One point to remember when using different brands of tracks: they may have a different thickness of ties and different rail profiles. I actually had to shim the Walthers switches up since they had thinner ties than the Peco FlexTrack. Even though all of the rail was code 83, the Walthers rail had a thicker base. Therefore, I had to widen the Peco metal rail joiners to fit onto the Walthers rail base. I placed one end of the FlexTrack up against one switch, then used the Xuron rail cutters to gently squeeze a mark onto the opposite end where it would line up with the other switch. Then I turned over the FlexTrack and cut off the plastic ties on either side of this mark. I saved the ties I cut off. I'll use these later to fill in the gaps. Then I cut the rest of the way through the rails with the cutters. I left a gap in the rail to allow for any expansion. Be sure to use a file to clean up the ends of the rails that were cut by the cutters and any burrs that were left over. For the curves, I used a curve alignment tool made by Ribbon Rail that fits in between the rails. They make this tool in many different radiuses. My main line curves are 28 inch and my yard lead is 25 inch. This tool will really help in getting the curves nice and smooth without any kinks. Peco FlexTrack is just stiff enough to hold its curve, but I still used some T-pins to make sure nothing moved while the caulk dried. One end of a block was on a curve. I used a Dremel tool to cut off the track where the plastic insulator needed to be. Then I continued gluing the rest of the track down, using the curve tool to keep everything smooth. After all the track for the main line was installed and the caulk dried, I removed all of the T-pins. Then I pushed a long string of cars around manually to see if there were any obvious bad spots. Other than a single rail joint that needed some slight adjustment, everything was good. For the spur to the grain elevator, I wanted to have the track look like it lacked proper maintenance. To do that, I cut out several ties, then I respaced the remaining ties out, leaving gaps and adding some crooked ties here and there. It's a subtle effect, but once it's painted and ballasted, it should really stand out. Using the ties I cut off earlier, then I use a sharp hobby knife and carefully shave off the molded on spikes. This way I can slip them up underneath the rail where the rail joiners are. Finally, I position the turntable pit in line with the yard lead track. Then I used a pencil to mark the outline, and I used a jigsaw to cut the hole. I cut the hole just a little bit smaller than the pit, just to make sure it wasn't oversized. It's easier to enlarge it as needed. Since I needed the turntable to be the same height as the rest of the track, I used some of the leftover roadbed to lift the pit up. I glued it down in the same way I glued down the track roadbed. I won't be able to glue down the service tracks that come off the turntable until the turntable bridge is finished. That way I can make sure everything lines up nice and straight. That's it for the track work. I really won't be able to thoroughly test everything until I get the wiring installed, but that's for the next video. As always, if you guys have any questions, leave them down below. Then if you don't mind, share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching.